This is the Chapter 3 overview, and this chapter is focused on globalization throughout time and in different spaces in the world. Let's get started here with this. If we think about world systems and hegemony, hegemony is a fancy word to explain a situation in which one nation, in this case one nation, has so much power and influence that they can impose rules and goals globally at the economic, political, military, diplomatic, and even possibly at the cultural level. And what is interesting is that there have only really been 3 countries that have been able to do this throughout time. First off, let's take a look at the modern world system. And this is an idea that is more recent from the 20th century. Emanuel Wallerstein, and of course other theorists too, have concluded in their research that countries, because they are not isolated from one another, and they trade with one another, and they think about way back, even to ancient China, ancient Rome, ancient Greece, etc. All of these ancient civilizations were trading with others. In fact, one of the oldest trade routes is known as the Silk Road. And it was called the Silk Road because apparently a lot of silk went from China to other parts of the world where silk was highly prized. And so these countries have always been, maybe a little bit less, but greatly today, have always been dependent or interdependent on one another economically. Some countries have some resource that other countries don't have, and so they've always found a way to trade with one another. And of course, as we are in the modern world, we see that globalization and that interdependence is even more robust than ever. In fact, one of the key sticking points right now, and I'm making this on April 11th, 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine a little over a month ago now. There were many people who argued, well, one of the key ways to cut off funds to Russia is to stop, for countries that get oil from Russia, to stop buying it. And that'll cut off funding for this war that Russia's waging on Ukraine. Sounds great. The sticking point is some of those European countries that get oil from Russia, Russia is their largest producer, or the country where they get the most number of barrels each year, which means that if they stop buying oil from Russia, then they have to fill that gap. Otherwise, their people will not have not only gas to drive their cars, but gas powers, other things as well. And so it's not so easy just to say, well, just stop buying oil from Russia, and that'll go a long way toward curtailing funds that they can get to wage this war against Ukraine. And so in this modern world system that we see, there are countries that have a lot more power than others, some that have very little power, and many in the middle. And so when we think about these core nations, or the different types of nations within the world system, there are core or developed nations. In fact, what many would call today not just core or developed nations, but post-industrialized nations. These are nations that had a very successful industrial history, but for the most part, they have moved on from manufacturing, and instead they create ideas. And so much of the manufacturing is done in other countries by multinational corporations who then send the product back. In fact, if you're an Apple fan, take a look at your Apple product, whether it's a phone or a laptop, etc. And what that Apple product says is created in the US or California, made in China. Okay, so the idea of the iPhone was created by people in Silicon Valley, but it's manufactured over in China. The semi-peripheral or the developing nations, these are nations that are independent, but they only have a moderate level of industrialization and development. And so you can see the list of countries there. Primarily, these are in Asia and a few in Latin America. And then the peripheral or the developing nations, these are the largest number of nations in the world. These are also there are more of these peripheral or developing nations than there are of the first two types. And of course, these countries are less powerful. They're less industrially developed. And these countries are primarily in Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. Oh, and there's just a quick chart there showing you what the per capita income is and the life expectancy. And you see in the core countries, not only is the life expectancy fairly high, although I'd say in the United States ours is lower than either of the other two that are in there with us, but you also can see the per capita income. So while in Switzerland, they have a very high level of per capita income and a very high life expectancy. In Japan, while the per capita income is not quite as high, they do have a longer life expectancy. And then you see the semi-peripheral ones here, and what their per capita income is. This is what, quote, the average income within that country for a person. And then you see the life expectancies here. And then for the poorer countries, the less industrialized countries, you see the annual income is much lower, and of course, the life expectancy is much lower. The technology, the medical advances are just not as available in these countries. A multinational corporation, these have been around for at least a good 45, 50 years. It turns out that large companies realized that it's cheaper to set up a factory and hire people in that other country, in some other country, to produce their goods and then ship them back to the United States. That is still cheaper than paying people in the United States to produce these goods. And so clothing, shoes, these are huge areas where multinational corporations are contracting with factories in other countries because the work standards are not as high, the safety standards are not as high, the wages are not as high. It's just cheaper to operate in that country. And sometimes a multinational corporation will create its own factory there and hire local people to run that factory. Sometimes there's a factory that's already making, I don't know, say t-shirts. And so maybe Adidas contracts with that t-shirt factory to now just produce Adidas t-shirts because they've already got the equipment, etc. That's a win-win. And I'm reminded, as I speak about this, of something that I found out, gosh, way back in 2004 when I was in Peru. I like to, when I travel, I like to try to eat and drink the local things because that's part of traveling to me. I'm not a big soda drinker, but I saw that on the menu that there was this thing called Inca Cola. And so I asked the person waiting on my table what it was. And he described it as tasting somewhat like an American cream soda. And when I was a kid, I liked cream soda or kind of like a ginger beer sort of thing. And so I thought, well, yeah, sure, I'll try one. And it was, pretty good and it was pretty sweet, but pretty good. So when he came back, he asked me, "How did you like it?" And I said, "Oh, yeah, it's pretty good. I'm glad that I tried it. You know, I always like to try to eat the food and drink of the local people." And he laughed a bit and he said, "Well, take a look at the label. Look at the bottle. Look at the information on the bottle." And so I turned the bottle around and I looked at it, and um, it was produced by Coca-Cola, and it said bottled by Coca-Cola. And I said, "What? This is bottled by Coca-Cola? How can that be?" And he said, "Well, when Coca-Cola came to, started exporting their product here in the 1970s to Peru, um, Inca Cola was the drink of the Peruanos. But and we didn't drink Coke. It was too different for us. So Coke just bought up Inca Cola, and now they produce Coke and Inca Cola here. And over the years, people have begun to drink Coca-Cola more and more. So really a case of a multinational corporation, Coca-Cola, not being able to beat out the local product, and so they just go in and say, "Okay, well, we'll just buy that brand too." This has happened to one of my favorite beers, and that is Modelo Especial. That's my favorite Mexican beer. I like Mexican beer in general, but that's my favorite one. And they were bought up by InBev. I don't know, maybe 5, 7 years ago, something like that. So it's no longer produced by a Mexican corporation. It's produced by an American one. Stages. There are stages that have been identified by researchers and theorists that world systems go through. And so the first stage is in the early years of a particular socialization. There begins to be this expansion in agriculture. And so machinery is created that then allows the people to not only plant more efficiently, but also to harvest more efficiently. And of course, fertilizers, and people understand how to perhaps breed different types of plants together to produce different kinds of fruits and vegetables, etc. And then, of course, industry takes hold. And so you can think about the industrializing period here in the United States. Think about initially lots of agriculture, particularly in the South, with the warmer weather, and the slavery system, and the free labor that plantation owners had at the expense, of course, the brutal expense of blacks. But then slowly the cotton gin is that's a type of technology that allows cotton to be picked more quickly. And then over time, as mechanized machinery becomes more and more widespread, we see things like the tractor and the plow and all these other things. And then once that takes hold, then we start to see that there's more of a focus on commerce, on ideas, on technology, on making things run more efficiently, and creating things for people that they didn't even know that they needed. And then finance, focusing on stocks and bonds and Bitcoin and non-fungible tokens, NFTs. That's where we are now. We're in that phase, the finance part. There's also the formation of an ideology, that is an idea, a philosophy that permeates throughout the society. And so in the United States and in many westernized countries as well, there's this emphasis on capitalism and free trade, and the idea that government should not regulate commerce and finance too much. That should all be left up to the markets. Growth of the military. Again, we've seen this happen in the United States as well. Military, various branches of the military have been around for over 100 years. But as we entered into the 20th century, with World War I, the United States being involved in World War I, and then, of course, subsequently World War II, more and more technology was created, more military funding was allocated, so that today the United States military branches are some of the most powerful militaries in the world. Not only do we have boots on the ground, as the saying goes, but all of the technology, the planes, the drones, the missiles, and of course nuclear weapons. And of course, the fourth stage, and scary or not, maybe this does happen in our lifetimes, is that the hegemonic power starts to decline. And as that hegemonic power loses the influence, then there's a restructuring of the system. Okay, so I want you to think about, I think I passed that one. It was oh yeah, those three those three countries that were able to establish hegemony. Holland, or often known as the United Provinces, from 1620 to 1672. So in the 17th century, for approximately 52 years, Holland had been able to dominate the world. In the 19th century, from 1815 to 1873, Great Britain had been able to do that. And the United States, from 1945, just after World War II, through 1967. Okay, now when you think about what happened, you recognize, at least if we focus on Great Britain, 1815 to 1873, you recognize that one of the things that happened in that period was that the Great Britain lost the ability to be to dominate in a lot of other countries. It had already lost its ability to dominate and to rule in what became the United States, but in various parts of Africa as well, as various parts of Africa and some parts of Asia. They no longer were able to have power there. All right, so let me get to this social inequality that we see within the core nations, and the United States, of course, is one of them. We see here that there's the capitalist class, right? It's the group that, Marx's words would be the bourgeoisie. This is the group of individuals who own the multinational corporations. They are the ones who possess a great share of wealth. And right now in the United States, the capitalist class controls about 90% of the wealth in the United States. Then you have the management or professional and management class, or the upper middle class. These are usually people who are fairly well educated. They often have advanced degrees, doctorates, etc., and they're generally well paid. The lower middle class, people who are small business owners, they're clerks, they're managers. They have some education, but they have fairly modest lives and homes, etc. The working class, these are both skilled and unskilled people. They have a limited form of education. And then the poor, who have the least schooling and the least and the limited job skills. So then finishing up with, in the peripheral and the semi-peripheral categories, you see here that if there are more groups, there are some that are similar to the groups in the core areas, but one of the classes that is present that is not in the core groups is the peasant class and the informal sector. Okay, so that's it for my overview of Chapter 3.